She heard it again, that thin, broken sound like a child crying somewhere past the trees. But there were no children near her cabin, not for miles. She stood frozen on the porch, hands still damp from washing, heart suddenly thudding. That's when she saw it. A dog, mangy, limping, streaked with mud and old blood. It didn't bark, just stared. Then turned, slow and deliberate, towards the woods. It looked back once, waited. Her bare feet hit the ground before she'd even thought it through. The crying came again, raspier this time, weaker, and the dog was already moving. She followed. Past her garden, over the fence, into the pines, her shawl caught on brambles. The ground grew darker, colder, but she didn't stop. Something in her bones told her the sound was real and close. The dog moved without sound, its limp strange and steady. Then it paused, ears low, by a crooked birch. And that's when she saw him. A boy. No older than 10. Shirt torn open, rope wrapped tight around his wrists and ankles, dried blood down one temple. His eyes met hers. Wide, stunned like he hadn't expected to be found. She fell to her knees, whispering, "It's all right. I've got you," as she reached to untie the knots. But the dog growled, not at her, but toward the trees. Her head jerked up. Nothing moved, no sound, no birds. Just wind pushing through the leaves like a warning. She worked faster. The knots were tight, cruelly done. Her hands fumbled. The dog stood between her and the forest now, hackles raised, body shaking from the effort. She finally freed the boy's wrists, then his ankles. He didn't speak, just clung to her, breath hitching like it hurt to breathe. "We're going home," she said, even though she wasn't sure that was safe. She carried him, slow and stumbling, the dog trailing behind, blood still dripping from one leg. It wasn't till they reached the porch that she saw it clearly. The dog's neck. Something was tied around it, a piece of twine holding a folded scrap of paper. She hesitated, heart thudding. Then she reached out and slipped it free. Her name. It was her name, written in crooked block letters on the outside. She unfolded it slowly, hands trembling. The boy's eyes watched her, waiting. And all it said inside, just 4 words, was this. "You said you would." She read those 4 words over and over. "You said you would." Her name was written so clearly it chilled her. But the handwriting, she didn't recognize it. She looked at the boy again, cradled in her arms, now shivering though the sun was still up. "Did someone send you?" she asked softly. He didn't answer, just held on tighter, cheek pressed to her collarbone like he'd been doing that all his life. The dog collapsed at her feet, its breathing shallow, one eye blinking with effort. She scooped up the old quilt from the rocker, wrapped the boy in it, and whispered, "I'll clean your wound, okay?" Still no reply. Inside, the room was warm and smelled of dried herbs and ashwood. She set him down gently on the cot, then turned to the cupboard where she kept salves and bandages. She didn't even realize she was crying until her hand started slipping on the tin lid. She hadn't had a visitor in 6 years, not since her sister left her out here with nothing but debts and rumors. But this boy, he looked like no one she knew. No neighbor, no kin, just wild, hurt, and silent. And that dog? Where had it come from, and why did it bring him here? She knelt beside him, whispering apologies with each dab of the cloth. "This'll sting," she warned. He winced but didn't flinch, just stared at the rafters like he'd been somewhere darker than pain. She thought of the note again. "You said you would. Said she'd do what? Take in a child? Rescue someone?" The words tickled something deep in her chest. A memory, maybe, or guilt long buried. "What's your name?" she asked. This time his lips parted. Calder, he whispered. Her breath caught. Not the name itself, but the voice. There was something about it, something that scraped the edge of her memory. She sat back, startled, trying to match it to someone, some place. Then she remembered something absurd. Years ago, when she was a girl, maybe 12, she used to write pretend letters to her future self. One of them, she recalled vaguely, had ended with a childish scribble. If you ever hear the name Calder, take care of him. Promise? She blinked hard. That couldn't be real. That was just a game, just a child's fantasy written in some torn diary. But this boy, this name, this note. Her knees gave out and she sat on the floor, back against the wall, stunned. What are you doing here? She asked, barely a whisper. Calder just looked at her and said, I came home. The boy slept. Curled in the quilt like he'd always belonged in that little cabin, his face softened and young in the lamplight. But the dog... The dog stayed planted by the door. It hadn't moved an inch since she brought them both inside. Its eyes never closed. Every breath came rough, and its side was matted with blood, but it didn't whimper, didn't beg. Just stared at her with something between warning and trust. She approached slowly with a bowl of water and a torn piece of cloth, whispering as she crouched. Let me help you, friend. Still it didn't move. It only blinked once, slow and heavy, as if saying, do what you must. She dipped the cloth and reached for its shoulder. The moment she touched its fur, something clicked in her mind, like a picture too faint to see suddenly sharpening. Years ago, she'd drawn a dog just like this. Same eyes, same scar down the ear. She was 16, hidden in her room while her father drank himself into curses. She'd sketched a world where animals showed up when people failed, where a girl could be saved by something wild. The drawing was childish, crude, long forgotten. Yet here was that exact dog, bleeding on her porch. What are you? She whispered, hands trembling. The dog didn't respond, of course, but it let her clean the wound now, flinching only once when she pressed the salve deep. She noticed something tucked in its fur then, just behind the collarbone. A scrap of cloth, soaked in blood. She tugged gently. It came loose with a soft tear, and inside was another note, smaller than the first, just one line. He belongs to you now. Her breath caught, her vision blurred. She turned to look at the sleeping boy, now breathing calmly, hand still clutching the edge of the quilt. A rush of warmth and panic hit her all at once. Who had sent him? Who had trained this dog to find her? Was this magic? A curse? Or something else entirely? Something she once believed in before life burned it out? The fire crackled softly behind her, and for a moment, the cabin felt like a storybook. Then the dog, with effort, dragged itself 2 steps forward, placed its head on her boot, and finally closed its eyes. She froze. No, she whispered. Don't you die on me. But she knew, deep down, that the dog had finished its journey, and its story had just begun in someone else's hands. She buried the dog at dawn, just under the elm where her mother used to hang herbs. The earth was soft from last week's rain, but each shovel of dirt felt like it tore through something inside her. She wrapped the dog in an old shawl, her grandmother's, stitched with sunflowers, and whispered, "Thank you for bringing him." The boy watched in silence from the porch, arms hugging the quilt around his shoulders. He hadn't said a word since he arrived. Not even when she'd offered him bread, or when she bandaged the scrape on his foot. Just watched. The kind of watching that measured things. When she came back up to the porch, she knelt in front of him, brushing hair from his eyes. "What's your name, sweetheart?" He blinked. Then, with a voice rough from silence, he whispered, "They called me Tree." Her brow furrowed. "Tree?" He nodded. "Because I don't fall." That answer stuck in her ribs. He didn't say who they were. She didn't ask. Instead, she held his hand and said, "I'll call you Tree then. But if you ever want to change it, you can." He didn't smile. But he didn't flinch either. That was something. She led him inside, gave him a warm cup of milk, and then did what she hadn't done in over a year. She lit the second lantern, as if making space for someone new. Later that morning, as she went through the ragged saddlebag the dog had carried, she found something she didn't expect. A folded piece of oilcloth. Inside it, a charcoal drawing. Her. Not recently, but her face as it had looked 6 years ago when she still laughed too loud and wore ribbons in her hair. She staggered back, knees hitting the edge of the bed. Who had drawn this? Who had kept it? Her hands shook as she turned it over. On the back was one word. Tansy. Her name. A name no one should know. Not out here, not after what had happened back east, not after she'd erased every trace and started again. And then it hit her like a rush of winter air. Someone had sent the boy. Someone who knew. Someone who still remembered who she had been, and believed she hadn't disappeared at all. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the dying embers of the hearth, the boy curled up on the quilt beside her like the dog had once done. Tansy stared at the drawing, at her younger face captured in strokes of charcoal and memory. The word Tansy looked like a whisper turned solid. She'd burned every letter from her past, thrown her father's ring into the creek, walked until her boots split. No one was supposed to remember her name. No one was supposed to find her. But someone had, and they hadn't come in person. They'd sent a bleeding dog with a message, and a silent boy who seemed stitched from sorrow. Just after midnight, the wind rose outside. The kind that presses against windows like fingers searching for a way in. She wrapped her shawl tighter and peered through the front curtain. Nothing. No horses, no tracks. But her bones said otherwise. The next morning, Tree was different. He didn't follow her like a shadow anymore. He wandered. He climbed the fence, stood where the dog had fallen, and stared into the woods with an expression too heavy for a boy his size. "He's still watching," Tree said quietly. "The man who sent us." Tansy froze, spoon half raised from the soup pot. "Tree, who sent you?" The boy looked over his shoulder, then back at the trees. "He never knocked, just left food sometimes. And stories. Told me if I ever found a cabin with sunflowers on the windowsill, I should go inside." Her eyes stung. Her grandmother used to grow sunflowers. She'd sewn them into the curtains, into the quilt now wrapped around Tree's shoulders. "Did he give you a name?" she asked. Tree nodded. "He said to call him Thorn." That made her sit down hard. Thorn, the name her brother used when they played outlaws as kids. But Elijah had died in the war. She'd seen the letter, buried it herself. "Was he old?" she asked. "Like a man?" Tree shook his head. "He wasn't big, not like you think. He had a limp, and a scar here." He pointed across his cheek. "Said the world forgets people with scars, but scars remember everything." Tansy's breath caught. Elijah had limped from the old fall on the barn roof. And he'd always said that line, about scars. Her chest burned. If it was him, why hadn't he come himself? Why send a dog and a boy? Unless he couldn't. By dusk the next day, the boy had stacked the woodpile into the shape of a crooked teepee just outside the front steps. Tansy hadn't asked him to. He'd simply said, He'll see it better if there's light. She didn't argue. She felt the edge of something rising. Fear, or maybe a reckoning she'd run from too long. That night, Tree lit the fire himself. Not with a match, but with a piece of flint and steel he'd had tucked inside the dog's leather collar all along. "He taught me how," Tree whispered. "Said if I ever needed him to come, I should light a fire where the sunflowers grow." That was when Tansy realized. This wasn't random. None of it was. Not the dog, not the drawing, not the boy with her name tucked around his neck like a secret. Someone out there had planned it, watched her, and somehow loved her enough not to intrude until she was ready. The fire climbed fast, orange and crackling against the black of the pines. The boy stood near it, arms crossed, eyes reflecting flickers like he'd done this before. More than once. Tansy sat on the porch, knees pulled tight, quilt wrapped around her as if the dog's warmth had been sewn into the fabric. And that's when she heard it, 3 distant caws of a crow, perfectly spaced. Then a pause, then one more. Tree turned immediately. "That's him." "Tree," she said, voice thin. "If this man is dangerous—" "He's not," the boy interrupted. "He's sad, like me, but he's good. He just doesn't know how to knock." That was when the air shifted. A branch cracked, not loudly, but deliberately. A silhouette stepped out from behind the trees. Not a cowboy, not a soldier. A man in torn leathers, long coat, face shadowed beneath a worn brim hat. He moved with a limp. A familiar one. And when he got close enough, the fire caught his face. The scar on his cheek wasn't new. It was old. A jagged white mark that crossed the left side of his face, just like Elijah's had been after the roofing accident at 15. Tansy stood, trembling. Her voice was barely there. "Elijah?" He didn't speak, just reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sunflower curtain. Her old one, the one she thought had burned with the barn. He held it out as if saying, "I kept what mattered." And in that moment, she broke. He didn't cross the firelight right away. Just stood there, holding that singed yellow curtain like it was proof of something neither of them could name. Tansy's breath caught. The last time she'd seen Elijah, she'd been on the ground, clutching her side, begging him not to take the saddlebag. Back then, he was bitter, hollowed by grief and debts, blaming her for a miscarriage that wasn't her fault. But now he looked older, thinner, weather-beaten, but softened too. She stepped down the porch slowly, past the edge of the quilt. Tree moved behind her, not hiding, not scared, just watching, like a bridge between what had been and what could be. "You left," she said, voice tight. "You ran." Elijah's mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, he looked down at the dog, wounded, tail twitching, eyes barely open, and whispered, "He never stopped. He tracked you for months. I only found him last week, bleeding, still heading north." Tansy glanced at Tree, then at the animal. "And the boy?" Elijah's voice cracked. "A note came to the station. Just your name, no return. Inside was a drawing. Him, standing by a sunflower cabin. I knew it was you. I knew what you'd built." "So you sent him?" she asked. Elijah nodded, shame sinking his shoulders. "I thought, if he made it, it meant maybe I was worth following too." Tansy wanted to scream, to throw every year of silence in his face. But Tree stepped forward and placed her hand into Elijah's, just like that. As if forgiveness was something you could pass between fingers. Elijah stared at their hands, eyes wet. "I don't expect anything. I just wanted to know if the fire still meant home." Tansy didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked back to the porch, Not fast, not in anger, just deciding. After a moment, she folded the quilt, set it gently on the top step, and went inside. Elijah looked down at the blanket. It was his, stitched by her years ago, when she still believed they'd grow old beside each other. And now it was back in his hands, an invitation without words. He didn't follow her inside, not yet. He just sank beside the wounded dog, one hand resting on its fur, and watched the fire die into coals. Behind the window, Tansy lit a single candle. She didn't say a word. But she didn't blow it out either. Tansy didn't sleep that night. The candle by the window burned low, flickering shadows across her face as she sat beside Tree, brushing the child's hair with slow, steady strokes. Outside, she could hear the occasional shuffle of Elijah's boots, the rustle of the dog's breath, the wind teasing the edges of that old quilt. Morning came pale and unsure, like it too, wasn't ready to face what had been left unfinished. Tansy stepped out barefoot, a tin cup of warm broth in one hand. Elijah stood, eyes sunken, face unshaved but still the man she'd once chosen. He took the cup without a word. She didn't speak for months, Tansy said quietly. Didn't even cry, just stared. Slept with her hand on the dog's side every night. Elijah looked toward Tree, now curled on the porch step, half dozing. She was like that when I found her, he said, but she still carried the ribbon, the one you tied to her wrist before the fire. Tansy's throat tightened. That ribbon had been her way of telling Tree she belonged, no matter what came. I thought you burned it. Elijah shook his head. I burned the barn. I burned my own anger. But I couldn't touch that ribbon. His voice cracked. I didn't know how to be your husband, Tansy. Not after we lost her. I thought hating you would make the grief smaller. It didn't, she said simply. He nodded. Number it just made me smaller. Silence stretched between them, but it didn't hurt like it once had. Tansy reached into her apron and pulled out the envelope he'd never opened, the one she left on the table the night she fled. Your name's still on it, she whispered. He took it, hands trembling. Inside were two things: the deed to the land, signed in both their names, and a crumpled drawing Tree had made of the three of them standing in front of the cabin, smiling. Elijah sank to the porch, eyes closed, breath heavy. You kept believing in us, even when I didn't. Tansy sat beside him. I believed in what we could be, but that's not enough. You have to choose it now. He didn't answer. But when Tree stirred and opened her eyes, she reached out, not for Tansy, but for Elijah. Crawled into his lap and leaned her head against his chest. He didn't cry. Not this time. He just held her like something fragile and sacred. And for the first time, Tansy didn't feel like the one who'd been left. She felt seen. The rain had finally come. Not in thunder or fury, but a soft, steady whisper that soaked into the earth like forgiveness itself. Tansy stood at the edge of the property, staring out at what remained of the old barn, just charred beams and wildflowers that had grown defiantly through the ash. Elijah came up beside her, his coat draped over Tree's small shoulders, as the girl held his hand without question now. You built it yourself, he murmured, glancing at the barn. Spent every night out here after you left, but nothing ever felt right. Tansy didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the smallest post that still stood, blackened at the top but firm in the ground. That's where we hung her name sign. Tree's Corner, remember? Elijah nodded slowly, his voice thick. I remember thinking we'd have 10 kids and they'd all sleep in the hay. Tansy smiled faintly. I would have settled for one that didn't cry through the whole night. Elijah took a breath, then reached into his satchel. He pulled out a tin box, old and dented. I kept this, couldn't open it, couldn't throw it out either. She opened it slowly. Inside, a pair of scorched baby booties, her own wedding comb, and a drawing of a dog, Tree's dog, done in her young, unsure lines. I buried this once, she whispered, under the birch tree. I dug it up, Elijah said. The day you left. I was angry at you for keeping it, then angry at myself for needing it. The rain softened the dirt around their feet, and Tree crouched down to trace her name in the mud beside the roots of that same birch. She's not the same girl, Elijah said quietly, but she still knows where she belongs. Tansy looked at him, finally, truly. His face was older, heavier, but not hardened. She saw the man she married, not because he was strong, but because he was still willing to learn. I came back for her, he said, but I'd stay, if you'd let me come back for both of you. The silence wasn't empty this time. It was waiting. Tansy knelt beside Tree and kissed her damp curls, then looked up at Elijah, eyes steady. Then you'd better help rebuild that barn. It's her corner again. Elijah smiled for the first time in years, wide and boyish, and Tree looked up, uncertain. Papa? She asked, and when he whispered, yes, her small fingers tightened around his. No more running, no more ashes, just the slow, quiet rebuilding of something almost lost. The townspeople gathered near the chapel on Sunday, not out of habit, but out of rumor. Whispers had spread that the woman who once left with a bloody dog and a bruised heart had returned, that she now walked upright, that she smiled, that she brought with her a child who no longer hid behind trees, but carried her own basket of bread. Tansy didn't come to make a scene. She came to sing. The new preacher had asked if someone could lead the hymn, and Elijah, quietly, without asking her, had volunteered her name. She stood at the front, not in a showy dress, but in the same faded blue she wore the day she left. Only now it fit differently. It fit like peace. When she opened her mouth, the song wasn't perfect. Her voice cracked once, but people leaned forward anyway, because it held something no trained voice ever had. Truth. Tree sat beside Elijah on the second bench, her small hands folded, her curls pulled back with the same ribbon Tansy had once tied around the bleeding dog's neck. Elijah looked like a man who had known failure and chose to begin again. And Tansy? She looked like someone who no longer waited for the world's permission. After the hymn, she stepped down, but didn't walk away. She turned, faced them. I once believed I had to earn my place in this town, she said gently, by being thinner, quieter, easier to love. But I learned something when a dog with half a heartbeat found me at my lowest. I learned that even wounded things deserve gentleness. That includes me. Silence. Then a child clapped, then another, then everyone. Not loud, but real. Outside, a carved wooden sign had been nailed to the church post. It read, Tree and Tansy, welcome home. Tansy stepped out into the sun, blinking. The same church that once shut its doors on her now rang with bells in her name. And when a woman in the crowd asked, Is that your daughter? Tansy didn't hesitate. She took Tree's hand and said clearly, Yes. She is, always was. Elijah caught up to her, and for the first time since their wedding, offered her his arm. Not as a savior, but as someone who had finally learned how to walk beside her. The wind stirred gently, and Tree looked up with her wide, knowing eyes. Can we keep the dog's name too? Tansy smiled. Of course, baby. He was the one who saved us all. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had found that dog on your porch, Would you have opened the note? Tell us in the comments.